Hey, good afternoon.
Hey, Airic.
Hey, man, how are you?
Doing well. How you all doing?
Doing good, doing good. My name is Brian.
Hi, Brian. I'm Airic. Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you, Airic. All right, well, interesting. I was just texting with Marie before this. It's all the way around interesting times. Are you guys all teaching this semester?
Yep.
Are you all
Yeah.
adjuncts full time? What's everybody's? I know Marie's situation. We've been talking, but what about each of you?
I'm a graduate assistant.
Nice.
At U of A.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the thing. Like I work at UACCM, the community college. I feel like I'm probably doing similar stuff as you guys in the classroom, but just for some reason getting paid more. You guys are probably doing way cooler shit than me. I know Marie is. So I teach at a community college, but it's all intro stuff. So like literally this like podcasts such as these are part of the way that I get out and around and do things, talk about things I want to talk about. So I appreciate you guys coming on.
We appreciate you hosting us and seeing how the conversation goes.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time to come on. So I was just, it's we're going to be talking about the state flag. I just brought this up. I teach Arkansas history introduction course. And it is like one of the first pictures on my slideshow is the state flag. And I had like when I pulled up, I had a student, a person of color, and I made some mentions about us going to do this podcast, and I was going to share it with him and stuff. And he was like, "Wait a second, are you saying that star is that?" And and what's funny is the student has had me in class before, and like we just haven't had that conversation yet. And he was like, and really, in my personal experience, that's the first time that I had a student that is a person of color in my class that got their mind blown and was like, well, that's bullshit. So like, that's super real experience for me that just happened last week.
Yeah.
So, but it's uncomfortable. I hate having to tell that story. I usually tell it like when we get to the Civil War. It just came up on the front end of class this time,
That, the typical response when you bring up the state flag is that nobody knows what the star represents, but, also, what nobody seems to understand or know. And I mean, and probably rightfully so. I mean, how often during the day do you think about a state flag? But the Arkansas flag is rich with symbolism anyway. And I think what's most interesting about it is that all of the other symbolism, was put there in 1913. And it's 10 years later that the Confederate commemoration is added. So it wasn't even the original design. It wasn't the original intent, probably. The woman who designed the flag in the state competition, Willie Hawker, she was a member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So, that could explain some of the design choice, but she didn't put, that Confederate commemoration there herself. That comes 10 years later when the second iteration of the KKK is a, fairly powerful national organization.
So what that's interesting. So like just telling this story to people that have never heard it, so can you explain real quick, one of you, like the basic history of our flag, what the symbols are for people? Because I assume that I will have people in my audience listening to this that are not even from Arkansas. So, but in that we're one of 5 state flags that have had symbolism added after the fact, right? Mm-hmm. But what could you tell us a little bit about just like the history of our flag?
Do you want me to, Marie, Airic, you want me to do that?
Go for it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so until 1913, we did not have a state flag. The federal government built a new ship, the USS Arkansas. The United Daughters or no, excuse me, the Daughters of the Revolution here in Arkansas, their chapter wanted to give that battleship an Arkansas flag. It was named after the state. So they go to the Secretary of State and say, hey, we want to give a state flag to this battleship. And the Secretary of State essentially says, well, I mean, you could, but we don't have one. So this initiates an effort to create a flag. So there's a statewide competition. There's a board put together. Ultimately, a woman from Jefferson County named Willie Hawker has the winning design. So the first design doesn't even have the word Arkansas on it. It looked how the flag looks today, except it didn't have Arkansas on it, and it had 3 blue stars that went across the middle. That flag goes to committee. As one of our current state senators, Greg Leding, put it, committees often make things worse. That committee put the word Arkansas on it. Now, I had somebody on Twitter tell me that was the equivalent of tattooing your name to your face. That is just kind of ridiculous. So that gives us that gives us Arkansas across the state flag with 3 blue stars, 2 below Arkansas, 1 above it. The other symbolism surrounding the flag, so a lot of times it comes up and they say, well, this flag is very reminiscent of the Confederate battle flag. And in terms of color and scheme and all that, it absolutely is. The diamond shape itself is supposed to represent Arkansas as a diamond-bearing state, Murfreesboro. The 25 white stars going around that are supposed to represent the fact that Arkansas was the 25th state added to the Union. On each corner, the 2 white stars are supposed to mirror each other to represent Arkansas and Michigan being led in at roughly the same time, not quite the same time, but often. We teach that as sort of a sister statehood kind of coming in together as part of the Missouri Compromise, 1 free, 1 slave state. And then those 3 blue stars represent nations that have controlled the territory of Arkansas. So France, Spain, and the United States. And then we have that flag for a decade. In 1923, the state legislature adds the Confederate star. Then the year later, they reorient those stars so that there's only 1 blue star above the word Arkansas, and that is to commemorate the Confederacy. So,
and what is the argument made for that? Like, well, it's the most recent, right? Or is that tried to explain? Did they try to explain that away at any point where like the choice is being made to put that star at the top?
So the argument. When they first added the 4th star, there's 2 on top, 2 on bottom, above and below the word Arkansas. In 1924, the year later, when they reorient it, their argument was that by adding that 4th star, it upset Willie Hawker's original symmetry. So they wanted to fix her symmetry.
Feelings.
They do not address, directly that they're putting the Confederate star above the United States star, which I think is important. This is the second iteration of the KKK was hyper obsessed with 100% Americanism, right? But the U.S. star was still subjugated to the Confederate star in their ultimate design choice, and that's where it remains.
Yes. Okay. So where do you guys come into this story? Why are we podcasting about this? So there's an effort to change some of this, and I kind of feel like it's the most that can be done, perhaps, right? Is to let's update the symbolism is basically what I understand is the most compromising move that can be made at this time, sadly.
Right.
Right. So what does that look like? This is I was telling Marie before this, we were texting, there's a rally in my hometown tomorrow. There's, this podcast is coming on the heels of the Confederate statue being taken out of Bentonville. Right. So this is a really interesting time where a lot of this stuff is coming to the forefront, but can you explain a little bit about the current push to update the symbolism and what where that is a compromise that is having to be struck because of certain people being upset about it, or groups rather.
Yeah, I can try, and then Marie and Airic can I think can contextualize why this is important much better than I can. But I can tell you what the current events are. So in March of last year, 2019, the House Minority Leader, a Democrat, Charles Blake from Pulaski County, introduced a bill very late. It's my understanding anyway that it was very late in the legislative session when he introduced the bill. And the bill called for a couple of things, and that was replacing the Confederate star with a U.S. star and making the current U.S. star a commemoration of the Native American tribes that have had jurisdiction over the Arkansas Territory. And that is in line with the theme of the flag. The blue stars are France and Spain, so Native Americans makes perfect historical sense, right? My understanding, that bill never left committee. There's kind of a late push for it. It never left committee, so it died essentially. Charles Blake is no longer in the Arkansas House. He is the chief of staff to the Arkansas mayor now. So what's interesting, I think, about the bill is that it was bipartisan. It was written by a Democrat. It had a Democrat co-sponsor, and then it had two Republican co-sponsors, and one each from the House and the Senate. And that's I think that's very, very important. I think that's maybe the most important thing about this bill, this effort, this podcast, the whole endeavor, is that this should not really be a political issue. This is an educational issue. And to kind of parrot what Governor Hutchinson said back in 2016, when Arkansas decoupled Robert E. Lee Day from MLK Day, Hutchinson said in an interview, this was an educational opportunity. We sat down at a table, we learned a lot from each other, and I'm paraphrasing, as far as I'm concerned, this was an educational bill. And that's how I view this, is it's educational. Last year, when this was introduced, the governor did publicly support it. There were a couple of news interviews where he said, yeah, I'm on board with this. I think that, he views something like this as educational as well. And that's how I view it. And that's really how I think we should, this should be tackled, is that what we're trying to do is not just say, hey, look, we have this commemoration to the Confederacy, and that's wrong. We should change it. To steal a current talking point, we should cancel it. No. That's not what we're trying to do. Everybody here is interested in accurate history, and so I do mostly the Cold War. I don't really do this era. I've had to do a lot of catch up on information to get my head around this, which is why Marie and Airic are part of this project. This is more their area, and this educational initiative, we can't just tell people, hey, we got to get rid of the star or rename it or do whatever with it, but they have to understand why. And I think, to do that, people have to explain, why was the Civil War actually fought? Spoiler alert, it was not states' rights, unless we're talking about a state's rights to own slaves. What happened, with Reconstruction? And then what happened after? Why was the second version of the Klan, able to exist? What was it channeling? The Klan didn't spring out of nothing. There were American traditions, and there were built-in American social systems that allowed the second KKK to come into existence, and then to take those pre-existing things and put them into overdrive and carry them forward. So I don't know where to go from that part of the conversation, but if you want to back up to the Civil War and the Reconstruction, Marie and Airic, I think, can really kind of put this into context for us.
Yeah, so if you, exactly what Will said about the education side of this, that's what brought the three of us together. We're all three native Arkansans. We're all historians. We all come from slightly different parts of the state, although Airic and I are both, Airic's from Little Rock and, I'm from Russellville. So kind of same part of the state there. But we wanted to bring this to people as educators, not affiliated with any kind of political ideas at all. So what we've been doing is just telling people about the history of the state in the Civil War and in Reconstruction, and about the second iteration of the Klan. So I believe that if Arkansans realize, and I think we all believe this, that if Arkansans really understand how bad the Confederacy was for Arkansas, how bad the first Klan was for Arkansas, then they will realize that that star is not only not necessary, but it's offensive as an Arkansan. And so, like, the Confederacy, when Arkansas joined the Confederacy never sent a group of troops to defend the state from the Union. The Union took back the Confederacy from Confederate control. They invaded Northwest Arkansas. The Union did very early on in the war. All Confederate troops were pulled from Arkansas very early on in the war. And Arkansans joined the Confederacy, but they were largely left to their own devices throughout the war. The Confederacy did this tax in kind in Arkansas, where they took Arkansan supplies that they needed to survive to send out of state. So yeah, maybe Arkansas was technically part of the Confederacy, but in no way did the Confederacy help Arkansas. It actively hurt Arkansans throughout its history. And so there is no reason whatsoever to honor the Confederacy on our flag. And then that doesn't even, yeah, go ahead, Airic.
No, I'm definitely not gonna cut you off. I want to continue on because you're speaking the truth.
That doesn't even get into Reconstruction when you have the first iteration of the Klan in Arkansas. And the first iteration of the Klan is far less organized than the second iteration. The first iteration of the Klan is also extremely violent. So the whole purpose of the first iteration of the Klan is to stop Black Arkansans from voting, to stop Black Americans in general from voting or having their new constitutional rights protected. And so the second iteration of the Klan, which is what will talk about or bring into the conversation, it is much, it's equal opportunity hate there, where the first iteration of the Klan is much more violent, overtly violent and racist, and more geared to specifically hurting African Americans, where the second iteration of the Klan is going to be a national organization who hates anyone who is not a white Protestant American. And during Reconstruction, the governor of Arkansas fights the Klan, calls up an Arkansas militia to put down the Klan. President Grant offers his congratulations to Governor Clayton during Reconstruction for how well he handles the Klan, which is something that President Grant does as well. And that's not part of the way that Arkansans usually remember their history. They don't remember the fact that the Klan was something that had to be put down, that it had to be fought because it was actively hurting Arkansans. They don't remember the history of the accurate history of the Confederacy. And after Reconstruction comes to an end and you have these redeemers reclaim control of the state, or so-called redeemers as they call themselves, but these Southern Democrats that reclaim control of the state, they push out Republicans, and they push out this any kind of progress that's going to come into play. And then that's when you have Jim Crow. Yeah, and that's where Airic can pick up.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue. And myself, I study U.S. history, race, and I study African history. But these are the conversations that I'm teaching in my class currently. Today, we were talking about, I'll get to the back end, but just to piggyback on what Marie was alluding to about Will's part of the conversation is, as we get towards that part of the 20th century, we look at questions of immigration and urbanization began to increase these anxieties that would expand the focus of groups like the Klan towards this 100% Americanism approach. But when we scale it back towards the era of the redemption, Marie highlighted an important point, and as I'm listening to the comments, um, um, I think it's important to highlight the the reason why Arkansans and Americans in general have this misremembrance about the Confederacy and this misremembrance about this era of our history is because of the deliberate attempt to change this narrative and change this memory during the era of the lost cause mythology. And it's important to highlight what Will stated about the flag, in my opinion, about where the stars are represented. Initially, the Confederate star was not highlighted above the state name, but this was changed during this era of the lost cause to accomplish many goals. Of course, to reassert white supremacy within this country, but also to reconcile the country North and South from its grievances during the Civil War. These debates over the institution of slavery were so long held that the country spent so much time divided over the future of America regarding the institution of slavery and regarding questions of race, that it took time to actually bring America back together again. And one of the reasons that it took so much time was during this era of Reconstruction, there was Black progress. And that Black progress was a threat to the reconciliation of America. And this Black progress is what the North and the South came together around to limit. During this era of the redemption, you saw regressions in voter, not only in voter advances, but also just in protections of basic civil rights. You saw the North and the South come together and reconcile over this concept of white supremacy. And during this era is when the narrative about the Civil War, about why the Civil War was fought, about the mythology of these Confederate generals and how valiant the Confederate soldiers fought against the Union. All of this mythology was created and embedded into the Southern identity and into Arkansas's identity during this time, even into the state flag. And so that's why it's important to me to highlight the symbology of it or the symbolism of it, because prior to this lost cause era, there was no calculated effort to change this narrative, right? But the onset of Black progress during the Reconstruction is what prompted this desire to change the narrative about the not only the Civil War itself, but how bad Reconstruction actually was for the South and for America, how bad Black progress was for the South and for America. And these are the conditions that allow for this lost cause narrative to come in and actually reorient not only Southern remembrances of the Civil War, but also America's remembrance of this time. Because again, this lost cause era was about reconciliation between the North and the South around white supremacy. And so the flag itself, the conversation itself is important because of the symbolism and the history of the symbolism. And I'll just be frank, as we've done these talks before, I'm from Little Rock. I'm an Arkansan. I've learned these things and relearned the real meaning of these histories through education. But in my day-to-day life, the Arkansas state flag doesn't really mean anything to me. Changing the Arkansas flag or the history of the Arkansas flag doesn't mean anything to me, more so than taking that Confederate statue down in Bentonville. I don't spend a lot of time in Bentonville, so it doesn't really matter to me like that. However, the reason that we misremember these things is important. The reason that we don't understand this history and we don't understand how these conversations about the state flag are tied to conversations about race and even conversations that we're having currently about race and history in America. These things are important because we don't remember them due to how history has been used and how history has been manipulated. And in going into this era, and I'll just leave it for Will to pick up, and going to this era of 100% Americanism coming out of, the early 20th century, even going into and coming out of World War I, this influx of peoples from around the world, not only from Europe, but from Asia, and this domestic migration from Black people leaving out of the South and coming into these urban areas in the North, these created anxieties that would expand the scope of nationalist groups like the Ku Klux Klan during this time, and allow for this conversation about 100% Americanism to not only focus on Black people in this country, but also other people like Jews, Catholics, all of these other demographics that the KKK, the second iteration of the KKK, will come to verbalize and target.
Hey, Will, so you mentioned the DAR earlier, right? So
yeah.
One thing like that is fascinating to me. So I mentioned like these tensions are playing out amongst people I grew up with. I grew up in Johnson County, Arkansas, in which in the 80s they were like, hey, let's call Johnson County West Side the Rebels. Let's make our mascot the Rebels and so it's just a reoccurring thing. And what has frustrated me teaching these topics is how many people I grew up with, alongside people in my communities, whether that is where I own a business now in the River Valley in Russellville or where I come from, they take this information very hostile, right? And do you think, like, when I talk with people, like, yes, the DAR, they asked me to write an essay it seems like these are entrenched in our elementary schools and that it's just like a systemic level to where it's easy to influence the education through these groups. DAR sounds a lot better than the United Daughters of the Confederacy too. But in reading about them, I mean, I'm new to this topic, honestly, myself, sadly. It's like, well, what's the difference? Like, that's kind of what I keep coming up with. And I don't know, other than I'm like, should I not say things? Because there's a big DAR group right across the river. And also a Confederate monument being held up. And that's a big point that we don't like to talk about when I bring it up to a lot of people. I mean, even in an educational sense, people just get hostile right now. And it's just like, well, hey, would you like to hear some of the history? Just like, I'm not trying to argue with you. But how does it become this, like, the narrative keeps getting shifted back to what we're saying. Like, it's frustrating for me, right? It's like every time I bring it up to somebody that's not an academic, they've grown up and like been taught this history. Even in the 80s, my aunt in 8th grade was at that school that the consolidation took place at. And it just seems like it's reoccurring all the time. Is it these groups? Is it the DAR? Like,
Airic, please.
I'll offer a quick opinion on it. It's the entire system itself. It's the education system. It's the people who make the textbooks. It's the people who write the curriculums. It's the people who administer the schools. It's the people who teach. It's how these teachers have been taught by academia, because even in academia, this lost cause mythology was taught and is still taught in many places up until this day. So by various professors and institutions of higher learning. So when you talk about systemic, you have to look at the entirety of the education process and understand how at every single touch point of it, this recreation of the narrative is effectively changing people's ideas about the truth. It has already changed people's concept of whatever truth is. And so when you share this new information, it's not new information. When you share this half told information, when you tell this full truth to them, it's jarring to them because of how they've been educated about this history. And they often feel the need to defend the way that they've been taught about this because of how systemic that education has been. They've learned it at every single level of the process. So when you share this information with them, it's jarring.
Right.
Right.
And they want to believe that they're intelligent people, and maybe they are. Maybe they absolutely are. And so when you say, no, you've learned this wrong, like this is just not the way it was, they do get more defensive. Absolutely, absolutely. And I also think that I don't know enough about the Daughters of the American Revolution. I know it's a heritage organization and that there's a lot of overlap between that and the UDC, but the UDC had a children's wing of the organization that was meant to indoctrinate children with their version of Confederate history, which was the lost cause. And they knew, the UDC understood that if you did not teach children your version of history, then you would lose it forever. And so they spent a lot more time talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction and the years after the Reconstruction. They spent a lot more time talking to their children about those things than other American families did. And so their children grew up learning that history. These are more elite members of society in general, wealthier members of society in general, so they already have more power. They grow up learning that history. They teach their children that history, and the UDC's plan to indoctrinate Americans' children, or at least the South's children, with this history is actually very successful. I mean, that's what we're seeing now.
Yeah, it is. I made, I think, 45 notes in the last 3 minutes. So there are tons of directions I think this conversation can go.
I know. I'm sorry if I went all over the place on that last rant, but it's like, I'm thinking like I just drank a coffee and you guys are talking and I'm like, oh. Anyway, so go ahead, Will. Sorry to cut you off, but.
Let's just see how this comes out and which order it comes out in and if it's coherent when we get there. So Airic and Marie might be able to correct me on this. I believe it was Gary Nash in the 1990s that was asked to be on a federal level panel to figure out a history curriculum for the United States. I believe that's true. I might be wrong. I think it was Gary Nash. What?
I think so.
Yeah, I think it was Nash. I could go back and look at my old comprehensive exam answers, but I don't want to read those ever again. So we're just going to say Gary Nash. So Nash and this panel of experts are put together in the 1990s. They're going to sort of reconfigure how we teach American history, teach a more inclusive version. So, here are the natives and here's the Black experience and the Asian experience and so on and so forth, right?
Women.
So once that curriculum was written and they put it forth to a panel, I guess a government panel, they were basically told no, because their version of history did not deify the founders. And that represents our entire problem with teaching history, is that people don't like nuance. And nuance is oftentimes, insulting to people. And it's not supposed to be. There's this huge bridge between people who study history professionally and then those who say, I love history. And by that, they mean, they like to watch the History Channel. There's a difference, right? So, and it's hard to bridge that gap. And when we try to bridge it, it comes off as very condescending, even though it's not supposed to. But no, and I have no idea if this is true, but this is kind of how I see it. When I teach the survey to US2, I spend a couple of classes. They have to read a book on Japanese internment in World War II.
I just talked about that today.
And there were 2 of those internment camps here in Arkansas. But, a lot of the feedback I always get from students is, nobody ever taught us this. Why didn't they? Well, my take, it was never taught to you because World War II was supposed to be a hero's journey, right? It is this heroic narrative. You've got D-Day and you've got the Battle of the Coral Sea and you've got island hopping. And you can't take that away from the people that were there.
My grandpa, man, he was at Normandy. Yeah.
Well, right, but see, you can't take that away from him. That was heroic. We're talking about a generation of people that pulled themselves up out of the Great Depression, and they went to Europe and they went to Asia and they killed the Nazis and they killed the imperialists. And they quite literally, for a brief moment in time, secured global peace, right? But at the same time that all these heroic things are happening, we are in this nation putting Japanese people in internment camps, and white and black soldiers are dying on the battlefield, but not together. They're in segregated units, right? there's this nuance, and that nuance does not take away from D-Day, right? But it makes the story more complex. It makes it more meaningful, okay? So when you approach people about these topics like the Confederacy, you are poking at their conceptualization of what it means to be American, and in turn, their conceptualization of what it means to be them. It becomes very personal, and that's why they get so angry about it. And I understand. I get angry when you accuse me of being an American-hating Marxist because I want to teach you real history. I understand that.
I'm literally worried about walking to the courthouse tomorrow. From 7 blocks down from where I grew up my whole life. I'm like, oh, I can't even go without worrying about it. This is a weird year to be worried about. Like, am I going to survive that? Like, but you know, it is, and it's shaken. Like there was punches thrown in my hometown over these issues 2 weeks ago, you know, and people are especially up in arms now. But and I totally am getting behind what you're saying. Is it's like it shakes their identity on a level.
It does, you know, and you know, Airic brought up the lost cause, and the lost cause is of immense importance to this narrative. I don't think Airic mentioned it specifically, but what also is important is the Dunning School of Thought, that for generations Americans were taught, and there was an academic effort out of Columbia, an academic effort to basically say Reconstruction failed not because radical Republicans lost the fight for control of the party, not because Republicans at whole lost their willingness to protect African American rights as opposed to protect business. There's a severe economic recession, depression in the 1870s. It's not to say, you know, Reconstruction failed because groups like the KKK weren't going to let it succeed. They said, well, Reconstruction failed because these newly freed Black people did not have the intelligence or the ability or the capability to vote, that they were too savage to control the political processes. And the Dunning School controls the narrative of Reconstruction for decades, for generations. And you couple that with the lost cause. What's so interesting about the lost cause with the United Daughters of the Confederacy is that they have built an entire constellation, if you will, around this idea that the Confederacy was more patriotic than the Union, that the Confederacy was defending the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, states' rights essentially, and that they fought and died to preserve the Constitution of the U.S., which is, you know, looking back with all the historical knowledge that we have, is insanity. But that is how it was taught. You know, when we talk about taking control of the educational system, well, in the 1920s, the Klan, in conjunction with these Confederate veteran groups like the United Daughters, wrote the textbooks for our schools. There's an author whose name I've forgotten, Marie can remember, the UDC book, the historian, the woman that wrote, what?
Karen Cox.
Karen Cox, yeah. So Karen Cox found in her research that people that had grown up in that school system that were, you know, very elderly, even in the late 1990s, still refused to believe that the Civil War was fought over slavery. And, you know, what I tell people is go to Google and Google the transcripts. So for Arkansas's example, the Arkansas State Constitution under the Confederacy, I actually have a note. I will read you exactly. Arkansas State Constitution, 1861, it uses the word slave or slavery 7 times. In Article 7, Section 3, it reads, the General Assembly shall have no power to pass laws for the emancipation of slaves. If you look at the documents issued by other Confederate states explaining why they were leaving the Union, the Declaration of Clauses of Succeeding States, slave or slavery, 83 times is used as a word. The Mississippi State Legislature, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. The Constitution of the Confederacy, slave or slavery 10 times, Article 1, Section 9, no law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed. You don't have to ask me or Airic or Marie or any textbook why the Civil War was fought. Look at what they left us. It's right there. They told us why they fought the Civil War, but these generations after the Lost Cause and the Dunning School and the United Daughters and similar groups have taken control of our history. So now, to try to come full circle, when we talk about this star, it's deeply personal because you have grown up, you have been taught that this is who you are as an American, as a Southern American particularly. That was a little preachy.
No, I mean, I think that's spot on, and that's kind of what I was alluding to with the comments about the symbolism with the star. If you look at Southern states in general, I believe one of the concessions that was made between North and South was to recognize the Confederacy in these various capacities, like state flags. And I believe that point where the star of the Confederacy is above the name Arkansas represents that the Confederacy was the leading spirit of what Arkansas would be, and that the Confederacy got it right. And that's why you see that in many state flags throughout the South. And so because of that, I think that you can't escape the importance of the conversation around symbolism. And that's why this current push to try to redress that error in the historical narrative is important. Yeah.
It is an interesting time where there are a lot of, I guess, generations alive that are still dealing with this too, right? Like you were talking about people that were elderly in the 90s, but it's like my parents' generation, like they are, so like the conversation I'm having with just people from that era, people who are like 60 years old, like, and then I've even had conversations with people on into ages 75. And the spanning from not being able to deal with it to racism doesn't exist. Like, and that's just in like that segment of demographic, right? So then it's like, it takes on many other interesting forms that I've run into. It's like, that's just in my immediate circle of talking with people. I'm like, how do you guys deal with this? You know, what do you think about this? I read that. Like, did you know the history was this? And it's always that demographic I just mentioned, like 60 to 75 years of age, that is the most hostile. It's crazy. Like, I would say that's how old that guy that threw the punch a couple weeks ago in Clarksville was. I don't know if you guys are following that story, but crazy. Like, I know the guy that's organizing this rally and everything, but it's like somebody just punched him. Right, like he's like, hey, well, let's talk, and it was like, and then then it just goes, lures him in to talk, then he throws punches. This is like an old man. Like I can't fathom that that's like the direction it takes. It's like, no, like I was really just wanting to have a conversation here, and it seems that like there's a certain demographic of the population that maybe because of the reason we're talking about, they can't even have the conversation with you. It goes to punches. It goes straight to punches. Like in that instance. And how, are we seeing that shift out of the narrative? And as we see that slide out of the narrative, is going to be more comfortable, I guess is a way to describe it. I don't know, because it's super uncomfortable right now to talk with people about this and just to go over the history, but everybody's not comfortable. Like, that's all. I mean, we are like, I love talking about this stuff. It's literally, I'm having a great time, but it is uncomfortable for this certain sect of the population. You want to have empathy towards groups of people, but how can you be empathetic to these groups of people, you know, that deny racism exists when we're talking about this version of history? And like what you said, Will, like, well, they left us this, like do a word search. You know, sorry for my rant.
I think part of what part of the answer to what you're saying is the way we're approaching this, which is education. I mean, it is, even if you just say, did you know this? Or let me talk to you about the real history. Yes, that can absolutely be uncomfortable for some people. And I doubt that Will or Airic know about what's going on in Clarksville. So you may provide a little background there too. But in that situation specifically, if people, like, there are going to be some people that completely shut the three of us down because we're from U of A, period. We're academics. They're automatically going to think that we are coming from a certain political angle because they've politicized education.
You guys Marxist.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, are you reaching for a gun right now? Okay.
Right. But I do think that we are having some success, especially individual conversations. Will has this great anecdote that I hope he'll share. But individual conversations, especially, we are having some success with this idea of a conversation about the history in general, about the education part of this. So it's about how you approach it, for sure. But there are going to be people who will never listen to this. We won't accept.
I guess why the rant, right, is like, I am, as an Arkansan, as a historian, as a son, and trying to reconcile the fact that people I love and care about deny the existence of racism. Like, somebody I love doesn't believe racism exists, right? So I like living with that is a weird thing, you know, and it's, and I still love that person, you know, so it becomes, it takes on these other forms of, like, you know, it's not as easy as me just unfriending this person on Facebook. It is so much more complex than this. And it's like, are they better served with me being around having these conversations, even though I'm getting touted as a hippie, liberal, Marxist, yada, yada, college professor? It's like, I just don't think that Jeff Woods and people were brainwashing me, you know? Like, I know this, every professor that Marie and I had, we went to the same graduate school, Arkansas Tech. It's like, those are nothing but great people. They weren't passing communist ideas into my skull for me to pass on to my students now. If anything, they made me, like, more accepting of, like, okay, I love this person who's a racist, and I haven't cut them off yet. Maybe they can benefit from me not getting angry about this towards them. I you know, that's something I'm still trying to deal with, like, on a personal level. I mean, it's just like, these are people alive in my life, and I don't really know how, and they're pissed off that I say the things I say and podcast about the things that I podcast, and that I'm teaching the real history. So it takes on this very, I think this is important to Arkansas history on that level too. It's like, yes, this is how it's impacting me as an Arkansan right now, right? And in my community even, it's like, another guy's been on this podcast several times. We're doing a series of podcasts on the lost cause mythology through cinema, right? And this is our hometown. It's having a rally tomorrow, and it's like, people are really concerned about just being able to walk to the courthouse. It's just
a Black Lives Matters rally, right?
Yes, right. You can't even say that because, like, the Marxist organization. Like, I literally, and it's just like, look, if I can't march to the courthouse for better equality in my country, like, that's what I'm here doing. And you can turn it into whatever you want to turn it into, because it is turned into, well, you know, are you a communist reaching for a gun? Like, what is it? Or is there going to be protesters bust in? I saw the Black Lives Matters bus at the Clarksville Walmart. Like, that was something yesterday. So it's, you know, the community is definitely up in arms. So it's a weird time across the board. Like, we've got statues coming down. It's fascinating time to be alive, without even getting into the pandemic or anything.
Yeah.
I would just offer the thoughts around that conversation around comfort, from my perspective as a Black man, from my perspective as a historian and as an American. The two things that came to mind listening to you all are a conversation about growing pains and a conversation about patience. So America needs to grow. We need to grow out of this. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to sit here and say that, it's right how history has been taught, because it's not. It's not right how history has been taught, and we can't grow without coming to that reckoning. We have to actually tell the truth about our history, even as a state. And so, comfort is not a concern of mine when we talk about education. I understand that certain people aren't going to receive it, and that's on them if they're not willing to grow because of the pain that's associated with truth and growth. And that's on them. But we need to be real in order for us to grow. And it sometimes growth comes with growing pains, and we just got to deal with that, because that's America has yet to deal with the growing pains from the Civil War. That's why we're still dealing with this issue right now, these differences and all these things. That's why it was mistaught. That's why the narrative was misshapen, because we won't come to a true reckoning. So until we are actually ready to go through that pain and deal with that discomfort, this is really just a conversation, and these are really just words. And then second of all, when it comes to dealing with these growing pains, the conversation about patience is important. When I talk to my students, I tell my students one of the worst things that you can do is engage in presentism. You can't assign your moral values and how you see the world based to these people and how they made decisions in their time. The world was different. These people lived in a time of social Darwinism, when they believed that people were fixed in their places in society. We know that not to be true, but we've grown beyond that. And so now when we're dealing with people who struggle with dealing with these truths, we have to be patient, because that's the goal of education, is to come to an understanding about reality, right? And so those are the two things that I think are most important to take away. We have to be real, even in the spite of the growing pains, and that we have to be patient with each other and come to an understanding, and not be so quick to assign a judgment on whether something is good or bad, especially when we're talking about things in the past. That's not productive to growth at all.
For sure.
Right now, I agree with that completely, and that that can be, that can be a problem. I think when you try to address these topics is you say, well, so anecdotally, I have a family member who will say, well, back in when I was growing up as a kid, an older family member, when I was growing up as a kid, my parents always used the N word. And, and they didn't mean anything by it. It's just what they did. That's just what they used. And, you try to say, to that people or to that person, well, that was a really racist thing to do. And then when they want to say, well, but at the time it wasn't considered racist. Well, it's always been racist, but I get their point. Like, so I see what you mean, that it was so common that it just seemed okay. Like I can wrap my head around that if I need to. And I can understand that. And, I can be patient with your story, but to Airic's point about growing pains, I've been patient with your story and with your justification of their behavior within the context of their time. Now I need you to be patient and let me explain to you, why they thought that was an okay thing, what they had been taught and what they were acting out without knowing it. Like, I need you to be patient with me, and it might hurt. Yeah, you're going to have some growing pains for sure. So, I can be patient with you, and I cannot, practice, like Airic used the word presentism with you, but I do need you to be patient in turn. Like, it's a give and take. And education is supposed to be a give and take, right? The best way that you learn is by understanding that you're wrong about something. Like, you can't know if you're right until you know how you're wrong, right? And there's this idea of like Marie mentioned, we're all from U of A, and that to some extent for many people already discredits us out of the gate. It doesn't matter that they're from Russellville and Little Rock, and I'm from Hot Springs, and that we are of this state, that we are products of this state, but we're also at U of A, and that and that discredits us.
Sidebar, I was bragging about having you guys. I'm like, I'm having 3 University of Arkansas professors on. Woo! Right? So just so you know, like, I was very excited about talking to you.
Well, for some people that might be, but for the general public, not so much. But we are Arkansans, and this is, educational. I think for probably all of us, it's probably also personal, for different reasons, for various reasons. If for no other reason, the fact that we have, a connection to this state, we are of this state. I had something else that I wanted. You guys kept going. I made notes, but now I can't read my own handwriting. So somebody feel free to interject and shut me up, and then it'll come back to me eventually.
Yeah. Hey, well, sidebar too. You guys feel free. Like I tell everybody is this your second time on, Marie? But like, I hope that you come on 10 more times, right? And all you guys, like, if you ever want to come talk about anything, I got a lot of interest. We can stick just to history or martial arts. Like my podcast studio is at my martial arts academy. Like it's, I'm down to talk Civil War movies with you guys or anything. So anytime you guys would like to come on, talk about your research or anything, consider this a platform or an outlet. That was like when Marie was like, hey, you want to do this podcast? I was like, yes, please. That would be great. That's exactly, I love doing this stuff. It is in our hands, and this is like the podcast embodies like everything I'm interested in here in my own state, and I get to sit here in my business, podcast about history. And if you guys ever want to come on again, you're more than welcome to individually, because Marie and I are, we do need to get on planning now that we're back in the swing of like a 1968 election episode, because the parallels between this year and 68 are wild.
They are. So, Marie mentioned, I had a little bit of an anecdote. I guess I can tell you about that. A couple of weeks ago, I was having my air conditioner unit replaced. It was on its last breath. It had to go. So we're having that done, and the guy doing it was a self-described hillbilly. Really nice guy. Older guy. Kind of remind me like an old kind of like, hippie, long gray hair, ponytail. Tell me he's a hillbilly. All right, we can go with that. I can dig it. So we're just talking in my driveway after all of the work is done, and I have no idea how, but somehow, like politics and kind of like the Confederacy and kind of these things kind of came up. I have no idea how they came up.
It keeps happening to me too.
I have no idea, and I just started talking to this guy about some of the things that we're talking about, because he kind of gave me the impression that he was kind of, more of this mindset, right? So I'm just talking, and we're talking about the Civil War and Confederacy and Reconstruction and the state flag. And he probably doesn't interrupt me for 15, 20 minutes, which I'm fine with. I love having a captive audience. And he just starts asking like a barrage of questions. We talked for over an hour in my driveway, just all of these questions. And at the end of the conversation, he says to me, when I got here today, he said, first off, you should know that I have the Confederate flag. My wife has been after me forever over this flag, but I have the Confederate flag because for me, it's Southern pride. And he said, when I got here today, I was one of those guys that I would argue with you and tell you it was about Southern pride, and I'm not getting rid of my damn flag. He said, but after talking to you for an hour, he said, I'm not that guy anymore. Nobody has ever told me anything that you just told me. He said, I had no idea. And I said, man, like I said, earlier, I said, you don't have to take it from me. I can show you where to go on Google and get transcripts of all the documents they left for us to read. And you can see it for yourself. And I'm fairly certain that he did. He had to come back 2 days later to like adjust something or something. And he told me he went home that night and said he just like, as quickly as he could, regurgitated everything I had told him to his family, and that he was so excited and that he was looking stuff up. And like, I'll probably never see this dude again unless I have a problem with my air conditioner, I guess. But to Marie's point, earlier, these just have to be like sort of soft educational conversations. And this was totally organic, was not planned. But, again, at the end of the conversation, I was the guy who, when I got here, would have defended the Confederate flag. I'm not that guy anymore. And that's, you're not going to find people that want to learn like that. But it was such that what that experience said to me was that this approach could work.
That's super encouraging, man, because I haven't heard, well, I will say like similar things have occurred with some people my own age through those conversations. But that's kind of like venting my frustrations earlier of like outside, like my parents' generation and stuff, of trying to have just those sincere, like maybe this guy was what, 40s, 50s or something that you were talking.
He was, he told me what year he was born. He was like 55-ish.
So like my dad just turned 60 the other day, but like that is the demographic that I want to like have the productive conversations with the most, and not to stereotype them into all people from this demographic or in Arkansas are this way or anything. Like I know tons of great people that don't fit that mold, you know, but that's super encouraging.
There are people our generation that don't fit that mold. I mean, generations are such, I mean, for lack of a better term, they're just total BS. Like, you've put, millions of people into like a box, and it says, okay, well, you're a boomer, so you were the product of your family being thrilled to have economic prosperity, and they had a lot of sex, and you were like one of 8 that was born, and then you grew up with all of these traditional values, and we'd reject all of them now. Like that, that doesn't work. It doesn't work. That's useless. Who cares? Who cares? The most interesting part of like that story is the sex part, but beyond that, who cares? So, but this guy, I think I think he qualified as a boomer, just like marginally, like right there on the end. I think the boomer cutoff is 1964. My dad is right there on the end, 1964. He's a boomer. My mom is technically a Gen X, less than a year later. Who cares?
I'm an elder millennial myself, I think.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think all of us are the elder statesmen and women of the millennialism at this point, which is also completely meaningless. If you grew up in an era where you've got mail like made you really excited, like you're not a millennial. Like, I don't know. Who cares? But anyway, that was encouraging. I'd like to ask Airic if he would, to kind of make this a little bit more historical for a minute. Between, let's say 1920, 1900 and 1920. So, really, after Plessy and then going up to like Tulane, Arkansas, there are, considerable issues of racial violence all over this nation. And I thought maybe Airic could kind of give us some of that if he's up for it.
Yeah, sure. I think that that history about the racial violence in Elaine and the racial violence at the beginning of the 20th century in Arkansas, and the reason that many people don't know about a lot of that racial violence is one and the same when we talk about this conversation about the flag and the symbolism and the deliberate effort to reinterpret this narrative towards the goals of white supremacy. But I would comment on the conversation that you had with the guy that came to do the work on your AC. Will, I think it's important. That story is good, and it's important because it demonstrates a few things for me. I think that this conversation and the importance about this conversation is largely for white people in this country. I think Black people grow up with a deep understanding of this hypocrisy. The education system may skew the facts around what we are taught, but just from a general understanding, I think we see things from a total different perspective, and so we aren't as wrapped up in that mythology that is taught many times, and not 100% exact, but I believe that to be the case. And in addition to that, I think that it's important to highlight that because this conversation is important for white people in this country, for white people in this region, and for white people in the state, I think that it's important that white voices elevate this conversation about the misrepresentation. And the reason I believe that is because that man that had that Confederate flag wouldn't have heard shit coming from me. I could have told him the same thing that you told him the exact same way, and he wouldn't have heard a single word of it, right? But the voice that it came from was important to him, and it was important because it gave him courage to actively go and relearn the things that he had been mistaught, right? It gave him a prompt to not just dismiss it as some political bullshit, but as an opportunity to actually learn and grow, because it came from a voice that he would receive it from. And that's why I think that this conversation is important, because anytime that white voices can begin to elevate this part of our history that has been purposefully misshapen, I think that that is going to have the most effect in educating people and actually changing minds and actually getting us towards some semblance of progress. But again, as I mentioned, the racial violence that occurred in East Arkansas and Elaine at the beginning of the 20th century, I think the misremembrance around these issues, the way that it was covered in the media, the way that the racial violence was basically swept under the rug, the murder of hundreds of African Americans, and the essentially mob violence that occurred in Eastern Arkansas, that was put down by the governor at the time. I think it was Governor Bruff. He called out the state, the state guard, the Arkansas state troops, to the Arkansas state militia, to come out and squash this quote unquote rebellion that was occurring in Eastern Arkansas. And this exacerbated the violence that occurred there as well. And so after these incidences, the actual facts around the violence itself was skewed in the media. It was literally whitewashed away. The gravity of the violence was whitewashed away in the Arkansas media and the Arkansas newspapers. And the way these events were covered it goes hand in hand with this effort to reshape the narrative around the Civil War, the narrative around white supremacy, and this connection between the North and the South. There is a consistent effort and a consistent strategy that is used in both of these situations, and I think that was kind of the connection that you can see based on some of the outside history, just beyond the state flag, that you can connect to actual events on the ground.
What was it? Maybe you guys can offer some insight just recently culturally that's going on. Like I've been seeing multiple people make remarks like, hey, well, the only reason you care about Tulsa getting bombed over here in the same time period is because you saw it on HBO. Like, have you guys been following with that? Like, they tell the story of the Tulsa riots in The Watchmen on the HBO. I haven't seen it yet, but that kind of got a whole bunch of people woke to the fact that it even happened. Right, like you're saying with Elaine, I had a historian on months back who's writing about this right now. He's writing a book about this. Mitch Lerner, he's a Cold War historian, expert on the Pueblo incident. But I mean, it's like people, they just don't know, right? And it's like, and it takes like a hit TV show on HBO to tell them what's up, and then they're like, oh man, I'm woke to this now, let me share about it on social media. But it's like it's a sort of a strange byproduct. I appreciate that it gets the conversation going, but it's a weird avenue. But maybe what do you think about that? You think we need more of that? Like, is that a positive thing, a way in which we could raise awareness right now?
Your podcast is. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Marie. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm sorry, Airic.
Go for it.
I think just what you're saying is just such a part of the lost cause. I mean, that's what you're saying, is that we don't know about Elaine because that's part of the lost cause. The Daughters of the Confederacy are never going to allow Elaine to end up in a textbook. They don't want you to know about that. And if they do allow it, it's only when it's taught as this rebellion, as this act of Black violence against white Arkansans. The truth of it is never explored. And so I think that any way that young people can learn this history is good. And from what I've not watched the Watchmen episode, but from what I've heard, it's very accurate. Yeah, I've heard it's great. And so if you're doing this history well, I don't think it matters the medium you're getting it from.
Sounds like we need to do a podcast episode over that Watchmen episode, honestly. But yeah. So yeah,
I would agree with Marie. I would just say that I think that these any opportunities to make people aware of actual historical truth is important. And I work in media too. I do film and digital media, and one of the reasons that I started um, my business and that venture was because of the fact that this is where people learn now, on your phone, you know, in these digital realms and in these digital settings. And it's a lot easier for them to sit down and stomach history when it's coupled with creativity, right? History is kind of like vegetables. If you think about the foods, you know, it's the stuff that you actually could benefit the most from, but people want the candy. So the digital realm is how we actually put the content, the nutritional value of vegetables into a format that they can consume like candy. And even if it's a difficult topic like race or like Tulsa or Elaine or slavery, or even now George Floyd, or any of the Black Lives Matter movements, or any of these type of conversations, you understand that it's difficult for people to engage in them. But by placing it into, especially history, into a digital format, it makes it more consumable. It makes it easier for them to sit down and grapple with it and deal with it on their own terms.
For sure.
Yeah. You know, something that was kind of interesting that happened with media right after George Floyd. Netflix and Amazon Prime both, and maybe some others, put together, you know, lists of documentaries that, you know, you might want to watch to better understand the context behind George Floyd. You know, kind of in a really interesting byproduct of the Trump Tulsa rally in June was that suddenly everybody learned about Juneteenth in Tulsa. You know, it just, media, I mean, yeah, it is, you know, like digital history. I mean, this is, you know, where things are going and how people learn.
People
talking to a guy yesterday.
Trump probably learned about it, and his administration. Like, not even talking shit about that guy, but seriously, like, I felt like they were not even aware or charting. It's like, or do you think, or was that I felt like it was a total ball drop. Like, oh, whoops. We didn't know that. Or do you think it was like, nah, we knew, we did it anyway? Like, what do you guys think?
Make America great again?
I'm not on that. Yeah. So it's interesting. Like, I was charting that, and I'm like, which way do I view this? Are you guys intentional here or unintentional? Like, was this a slip up, or because I could totally see him not even being aware of it.
Of all places to go, of all days, the president doesn't move by mistake at all.
That's a great point. That's a great point too. And like, so like, that's like, so some value in like me looking at that from that perspective, and you putting in context there of like, no, and I'm not even conservative leaning, would vote for that guy, support that guy in any way. Matter of fact, somebody shared there was a flag hanging up right across from their house this morning that said "F your feelings," and I was like, really? Like, it was a Trump 2025, but it was like "F your feelings," and I was like, that's the opposite of the direction I'm trying to head with this, guys.
No sense of irony. So, you know, I'm trying to think of. There's a couple points I want to make. We can just kind of backtrack a little bit, and it's sort of on point here with this digital media and the impact that digital media has. I think if we want to talk about visual history and its impact and put this into historical context, Birth of a Nation, 1915. You know, Birth of a Nation, and this can kind of get us into the second KKK too. You know, Birth of a Nation, based off of a series of books from 1905 by Thomas Dixon, a guy from North Carolina, very much, you know, a lost causer, you know, that sort of guy. Between Dixon's book and the film adaptation by Griffith, D.W. Griffith.
Yeah. We just did a podcast on that to open our Civil War Lost Cause mythology series.
No, Birth of a Nation created the platform for the second KKK to jump from and form. You know, that movie is insane. I show clips of it to freshmen. First off, the film is full of Black people, but none of them are actually Black people. They're white people in blackface. Okay, so you've got white people in blackface playing the role of these savage, newly freed slaves that cannot engage politically, and more importantly, they cannot be trusted to be anywhere near white women. You know, white women and their sexuality and you know, and the virtuousness of their sexuality are always the main concern of, you know, of the KKK. You know, Ida B. Wells at the turn of the century put together her study that basically showed almost every lynching that happened was the product of a false report of a Black man raping a white woman. You know, that's what got Ida B. Wells essentially kicked out of the South, because they were going to lynch her for, you know, for making that a point. But Birth of a Nation depicts all of this. The first version of the Klan does not burn crosses, and it does not wear white hoods. Birth of a Nation creates that. The second KKK was very much life imitating art. The guy in Georgia who created that, Simmons in Georgia, who created the second KKK, you know, he looked at the first Klan and he looked at Birth of a Nation for all of his inspiration, and he designed it around that. With, you know, one really specific exception, was that the first Klan was, you know, loosely organized by state, and its primary role, female sexuality aside, its primary role was to deny Blacks the right to vote, and to deny them, you know, their political, you know, their political participation, and to deny them any sort of successful economic participation. That was their main goal, right? So once those goals are achieved, there's actually an author, Linda Gordon, who says, you know, the first KKK disappeared mostly because they achieved their goals, and like they didn't have to really hang around. But Simmons bases his second Klan off of them. He bases all of the imagery and the ideology off of Birth of a Nation, with the exception of, because at that point, the way African Americans were treated in American society in the 19 teens wasn't in question anymore. North or South, it wasn't in question. Everybody just knew how you treated African Americans. So the second Klan didn't have to focus on them. The second Klan was able to grasp on this idea of 100% Americanism after World War I, the idea of return to normalcy, and focus on specifically above Blacks in most instances, particularly in the northern branches of the Klan, focus on Catholics and Jews. They were significantly anti-Semitic. They were extremely anti-Catholic. And these had international contexts. They're so against Jews because, like the Nazis that will believe the same thing after them, you know, they thought all Jews were, you know, going to take control of the banks and of the economy and, you know, engage in loaning money at extremely high, you know, interest rates, you know, all of these stereotypes.
Not to mention they killed Jesus.
Not to mention they killed Jesus. And then with the Catholics, well, you know, the Catholics had to look to the Pope. The Catholics in their mind could not be good members of a democratic society because they looked to the Pope, right? And the Catholics also wanted to control the country in the Klan's ideology. So the Klan by 1921, you know, greatly expanded their target. And I mention this specifically because I want to keep this somewhat in context of the Arkansas state flag. When that Confederate star was added, it was added by a state legislator that was dominated by the Ku Klux Klan. Arkansas had tens of thousands of Klan members. Little Rock was the home of the female auxiliary of the Klan. The man, Neil Bollinger, from Pulaski County, that won his seat in the Arkansas Assembly because of a rigged Klan election, was the man that put forth the bill to have the Confederate star added. So the Confederate star isn't just all of these things about the Confederacy and Reconstruction. It was added by the second iteration of the Klan that hated you for being Black, Catholic, Jew, immigrant, if you were anti-prohibition, if you were almost always, it's kind of a weird relationship with the Klan, if you were pro-women's voting rights, they hated you. Although they used Klan women's votes to control elections, but everybody else. The second Klan hated everybody that wasn't a white Protestant, that bought into their ideology, right? So this group that hated everybody, that hated me, that hated you, that probably hated most of the people in the state today, put this star on our flag. And by leaving that star on the flag, we have allowed these very hateful people to commemorate an equally or more so hateful entity in the Confederacy that is supposed to represent all of us as Arkansans. So there is, I think, a significant moral and ethical argument to be made that whether or not you even like the history, you can't deny what the Klan was.
How much of, and you know, Marie, I've seen you make comments on this, and like it just keeps popping into my head, but like, what parallels are there between like what you're talking about and we mentioned earlier, but it's like it seems like if you are toting these ideas or talking about it now, you want equality and you're a Black person, well, you must be a communist. Or are you reaching for a gun and are you also a sex offender? Like, it's just like everything is a move, is some sort of weird move to discredit, but I see the discrediting terms, while they may have shifted a tad in a different extreme direction. It's like there are some reoccurrent things, like calling someone a communist to discredit them, like that we're seeing now. That I'm like, with the comments about like Black Lives Matter, it being a Marxist organization, but it's like that's a reoccurrent theme that I see coming from the time that you're talking about. Honestly, I mean, a little bit forward, but in the zeitgeist of what you're saying. Like,
yeah,
what sort of link?
I would agree.
Like Cold War era stuff like that, basically.
Well, Airic, did you want to have something?
Yeah, I'm not going to speak to the Cold War aspect of it, but I will just speak to the link between what you referred to as the zeitgeist, this conversation about the connection between Black progress and socialist influence. These things, this Elaine itself was a labor movement, and it was the reason that these people were easily targeted is because they were connected to these socialist aspects and these socialist elements. But I think it's important to understand that even when we talk about the growth and the evolution of the Klan and these aspects of white supremacy, you have to understand that that history is not linear. History is not even cyclical. It's more spherical. There's a continual evolution, and you're never at the same point in time, even though you can look like you're in a similar position. And so I would argue, even in pushback against those who argue that the Klan had achieved its goal, I believe that the Klan infiltrated American systems and continue to infiltrate American systems as opposed to go away. If you actually look at that time period, when we look at the progressive movement following the end of Reconstruction, there was a push against these groups like the KKK, right? There was a push, when you talk about this push against the evolution of the Klan, a lot of it becomes because of these expansions in the progressive movement, whether you're talking about women's rights, whether you're talking about immigration rights, whether you're talking about labor organizing and these groups that came to provide organizing for these immigrant and African American laborers. All of these things, like they don't happen in a vacuum. And so the evolution that leads to this second KKK comes out of these this same zeitgeist, as is referred to, that expands. The second KKK's target is allowed to expand, not because the KKK achieved its goals necessarily, but because there was pushback against these type of groups, but also there was an infiltration of American systems by these types of groups. So you didn't need to see a Klan as much until you started seeing more Black and brown people immigrate from overseas, or you see Black people migrating from the South into these urban areas, to where you see a need to reassert that visible power. because the conversation that we're having today is entirely about power, right? And it's about controls the power of the narrative. There's this African proverb that goes, "Until the lion has its own historian, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." And because the Daughters of the American Republic and the Daughters of the Confederacy and all these groups were in power and allowed to create this narrative, we have this misshapen information. But at its core, the ability to record the narrative is a question of power, right? And so when people take offense to how they've been taught this history, it's because they feel less empowered. They take it personally because they feel like it's a direct attack on the power that they have as an American, or the person that they are in this, or that they've been taught that they are in this country. And I would challenge people to see not the expansion of equality for Black people and for people of color as a challenge towards your personal power, especially as a white person, but I would see it as an expansion of America's power, because America would then actually be standing on the ideals that it was on paper founded on. Even though in history we know that these ideals were complicated at best, because the people that wrote them were slave owners. So this complicated history has always been a part of America, but we have to actually start to deal with that to move forward and to actually begin to empower more people than just those who have traditionally been empowered.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I was doing some diversity training for work on microaggressions, and they were like, it was actually super beneficial. Like, I keep talking to people about how much fun I had at the training, but they one thing is, like, they were like, okay, well, the United States, if it starts living up to its ideals by 2045, is going to be multicultural, multiracial, and everything. And like, quite literally, and they kind of like set this up. They're like, and I bet you are thinking, where does that leave you? And I was like, damn it, it does, you know? And it's like, and I'm not even anybody that comes down on like, yeah, it's super uncomfortable for me and my offspring. Like, it's not. But for a lot of people, and it is just like that first thought of like, that's what equality looks like. It's like, yes, that's evolution. We can live up to our highest ideas. And that doesn't mean that I have to go away, that my descendants are like, oh, no more white people, or whatever it is that people built it up to be. I think that's just living up to our highest ideas that we've always said we were trying to live up to. And until we own these things, and also the way I think we say these things, like somebody was making a point the other day that was like reading an article that was saying that George Washington's teeth may have been sourced
from enslaved people. Yeah,
may have been sourced, guys. Okay, that's a great way of saying that and
stolen.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, dentist man, I'm going to pay you to extract those teeth for me, is how I read the story, and how I've talked with people about it presently this week. But just the way it was told, it's like, well, if we say they were sourced, well, and also not only that, this was a common practice in Europe with peasants and poor people. That's why it's normal for slaves to want to give George Washington his teeth. Like, I just can't tell it that way. Like, and when I read that article, I'm like, why'd you say sourced?
Intentionally.
That's what you get at Whole Foods, not. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. But I think like you said this earlier, just like conversations such as these, free flowing. I thought about I was kind of messaging Marie. It's been a crazy, like, back to school time of like just seeing like, hey, how's this conversation need to go today? But it's like, I just like them going all these crazy directions, and I don't know. I grow from it. It's chaotic, I realize, but it's
it's organic. So to kind of mention Elaine again, and you asked about the Cold War. So there is a connection. even if it's not readily apparent. So, it is no mystery, at least to the four people here, and hopefully not a mystery to anybody, that Americans, since the last third of the 1800s, have been very, depending on where you are in the country, anywhere from anxious to outright terrified of labor movements and labor unions, right? These things, push back on the worldview of, kind of unfettered capitalism, profit above all, right? When you see your economic system as perfect, it's difficult for you to wrap your mind around how you might need to change it. So with Elaine, and Airic mentioned this, Elaine was a labor movement. You had an area of Arkansas, majority Black, minority white, but the Blacks were trapped in a peonage system. They're producing most of the crops. They don't control the price. So they were forming a union in order to take control of their livelihood. And this ends up with, they're having a meeting in a church. A few random white guys show up. They shoot into the church. One of the white guys is eventually killed. Testimony later by some of them that were there said that they were killed in crossfire. It's not really readily apparent from best I can tell. But what you end up with is a multi-day race massacre in Elaine, because these Elaine Blacks wanted to unionize. It's this fear of a labor movement. And, as Airic mentioned, the state National Guard and the governor show up during this process and exacerbate the issue. But even beyond that, this fear of unionizing Blacks was so pervasive that white people from Tennessee and Mississippi crossed the border to help put down this so-called, rebellion of Blacks. I mean, this is atrocious. And then generations of people from this area covered it up. We still don't know what the death toll is because it was covered up. We get numbers anywhere from 20 to 850, but it's a race massacre. And I think that the typically accepted number is 200. Marie or Airic might have a different number for that. There's an international context, and this is kind of how I'm going to try to segue that to the Cold War. The international context is that while there's this existing fear of labor unions, there is an exacerbated fear of labor unions, because while Elaine is happening, the United States is quietly intervening in Bolshevik Russia, trying to help the White Russian army put down the Red Army. Now, that's a failure, by the way. This is also why the KKK is so damn scared of the Jews, because in the United States, Woodrow Wilson himself thinks that all Bolsheviks are Jews. And Jews and Bolsheviks in this equation are bad. So Elaine is multi-layered. It's local, it's state, it's national, it's international. There's an immense fear about labor. So then you fast forward to the Cold War, 25 years later, give or take. And, you're asking about kind of, or you asked about, kind of how do these mindsets sort of, continue to trickle down, the timeline. I tweeted during the president's inauguration speech that Joe McCarthy has won, because that's all I could wrap my head around, was this very dark vision of the United States that has been infiltrated by the Marxist, by the communist. It was very Nixonian, and most of his campaign has been very Nixonian. He's teetered between Nixon and Reagan on some things, and has in 2016 as well. But that McCarthyism, that undermine your power and your authority, and just undermine your very humanity and your livelihood by accusing you of being a communist or a Marxist, which are, embedded in the American psyche, is antithetical to being an American. That is the easiest way to discredit somebody. So, when people in this conversation, talk about these things, the easiest way to discredit us is, and this has come up, is say, well, he's a Marxist. And that's total bullshit. I buy the new iPhone every time it comes out. All right.
Upgrade right now.
If anything, punish me for, giving the Chinese money. I don't know what to tell you. The Chinese also being, more capitalist than anything at this point economically. but it discredits people. And what people can't seem to wrap their mind around, and this goes to the conversation you were having a minute ago about, and then the comments Airic made about, on paper, 1776, 1783, 1789, on paper, we have these fantastic ideas, these universal ideas. Everybody's equal. And over the course of American history, it has been a fight to make sure that everybody is equal. Is it, do just elite white men get to vote? Do all white men, regardless of economic status, get to vote? At what point do black people get to vote? At what point do white people get to vote? Or excuse me, white women get to vote? At what point do we have labor unions, immigrant rights? At what point do we give children the right to not be worked to death in factories? This is a constant struggle. So you have this vision of America on one hand that we have achieved all. We've got the colorblind conservatism thing going on. Racism is gone. We're all equal. Grab your bootstraps. Unless you're an automotive industry or an airline, then we're going to bail you out. You don't have to worry about your bootstraps. But grab your bootstraps. Or maybe even a farmer. You don't have to always do bootstraps as a farmer either. But on the other hand, you have people like us saying, hey, look, we have these really awesome ideas that were written on paper over 200 years ago, but we haven't achieved them. And we want to achieve them not because we hate the United States, but because we love the damn place. And when you love something, you push it to be better, whether it's a spouse or a kid, or if I, want my cat to be nicer in the mornings. You push them into different behavior because you want them to be better. I don't hate America. That's ludicrous. That's asinine. If you want to talk about cutting off a conversation, that's how you do it. It's bullshit. What we have is the realization that we haven't achieved those goals. And that's all we're trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've devoted our lives to the study of this country's history. How could you say that we hate this country? But that's exactly where it goes.
Well, and then too, so I think everybody today has demonstrated a pretty, and how do you have we have to have a good attitude about it. It's kind of like getting picked on, right? I gotta have a good attitude about it. I can't get emotional. I can't get upset, right? It's something I've dedicated myself to. It's actually what you're saying. It's that I love this place. It's that I want this idealism to be achieved. I'm an idealist, and it has been my downfall many times, right? But it has also been things that have pushed me to success in every aspect of my life to be better. So it's interesting how idealism can kind of take both, though. A little too much of it over here. And
yeah, I want to build on something that Airic said a few minutes ago, if you don't mind.
For sure.
So talking about Elaine as this labor movement and the idea that Elaine was kind of vilified, or the movement that was going on in Elaine was vilified by calling it socialism, by calling it communism. You mentioned earlier about what I study. Well, in the Cold War, the White Citizens Council takes that idea and applies it to the NAACP as well. I mean, you vilify the White Citizens Council completely vilified and outlawed in many cases the NAACP, and they had the support of white Americans because they called it a communist organization. So anytime you have equality, I mean, and that's just one specific example of this overall idea we were talking about, but anytime you have equality, especially in the South, movements for equality, they are immediately labeled communist. And that goes back to Elaine because of what's happening in Russia in the late after World War I. And then that gets us to the 1950s at the height of the Cold War with the Citizens Council as well. So that charge of being a communist, if you're for equality or for racial progress in any way, that is deeply entrenched in modern American history.
And I think a lot of people actually especially label Black movements as anti-American because Black people have always challenged the soul of America. Black people have always challenged America according to the ideals that were put on paper, because if the least of these don't receive the rights that are guaranteed on paper, then no rights are guaranteed for anybody. But I will also say that I don't think that this is uniquely American, because even if we look at the founding of the country and the ideals that America was founded on, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they were derived from life, liberty, and the pursuit of property from John Locke, and that's a British concept. So those ideals are universal, as Will mentioned. But for me, the reason that I don't hold America to these same ideals is because I look at these founding principles and I understand that the same man, John Locke, who gave these ideas, would also make the same comment that any Negro slave was to be under the complete control of his slave owner, whether it was in regards to religion or whatever else. And so the fact that these two statements come out of the same mouth to me is American. Is America's truth, is the fact that we were founded on these ideals, but in practice, we have never lived up to them, and they are worthy of striving towards, but we can't acknowledge that, or we can't strive towards them in earnest until we acknowledge the falsehoods that the practice of America has actually been, and the experience that has been for Black people and for people of color.
Mm-hmm. That's the dichotomy of the Enlightenment, man, is that you have these people expounding these ideas while also capitalizing in every way off the slave trade at the time that they're drinking the coffee that makes the ideas a little bit more inspirational, right?
Well,
it's like,
colonialism.
Yeah, that's always been something that's fascinating to me about the Enlightenment, just being a period I'm interested in. I took a course over that as an undergraduate that say no longer even offer that course at Tech. That was one of Krieger's last courses that he taught was the Enlightenment. But that was always a dichotomous sort of idea. But what you're saying is like we need to say both also. Like we need to say where these ideas came from, like, yeah, here's where they are in America, but let's go back and look at how this guy that we keep talking about, what he really thought, right? That's
his ideas became what Thomas Jefferson put on paper, and these ideas, universal and noble as they are only ideals until they become reality. Like the work is actually making these ideals reality, and that is the real dichotomy for me. This is something that I think about historically, is the dichotomy between these ideals and the economic system that America is built on. Because these ideals, the economic system, is what created the conditions for these ideals to be complicated, is what created the conditions for these ideals to be put on paper, but then not activated in practice. The fact that you can profit so much from not holding up these ideals and this capitalist system is what actually the question of America, and it gets at the core of America. And I think that that's another reason why when you present these ideas to people, they are quick to label you communist, or to label you Marxist specifically, or to label you as anti-American in that economic sense of you're against the capitalist ideal of America, right?
I'm against the idea of thinking we have it all figured out.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's better ways to do all the stuff that we talked about today. Right. I mean, it's 2020. We're, just since being strapped to only writing things on paper to this podcast, right, it is a whole other realm for us to be entering into. So.
I didn't mean to throw us off topic, man. My bad.
No.
I was just...
Well, like this guy's cat's bouncing around here. This is an organic conversation with. I'd say we've done better than like me trying to talk to 3 of my friends. We would have been like way more all over the place.
It's been historical the whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been mostly within context with a little bit of cynicism here and there, but find a historian that isn't cynical, and well, you haven't found a historian. So
well, and then you find like. I'm searching for answers here, and you guys know things that I don't, and I can benefit in this conversation from operating under that assumption in every way, right? It's like, and just being real and asking stupid questions. I do that all the time, right? Like, I don't have this all figured out. Like the amount of potential history versus what I know versus what I want to know, and the amount of time I have to learn it. I'm just like, oh, what's this book? He's Linda who, right? I got to read that later.
So this is good. And this is, I mean, kind of
I already added
point.
it on my Audible since you held it up a second ago.
So it's from 2017. It's the second coming of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s and the American political tradition, Linda Gordon. And her argument, I think, I haven't finished it. It came in the mail today and I read part of it. Her argument, I think, is kind of on point with something Airic said at some point earlier, about how these sort of traditions, like the tradition of the first KK, how they linger, and in his spherical analogy that he made, how they don't really ever go away. And her, kind of her assertion to this point anyway, is that the second KKK took existing zeitgeist, to use your word, in America that was racist or anti-Jew or anti-Catholic or anti-immigrant, and the second KKK was able to exist because it had that platform to leap from. And the second Klan is only around for about 7 years. It's dead by about 1927, but it lasted long enough and it entrenched those ideas long enough to give them like a steroid shot and push them forward. And then the ideas that they were able to co-opt to exist, they are able to give to future generations to in turn use again. So, the idea of sort of, the white Protestant besieged mentality, our culture is under attack always, our religion is under attack, our economic system is under attack always. These sort of almost paranoias, paranoias that you see come up with McCarthy or with Nixon in the early 1950s. The paranoia that LBJ had, that he would lose the election to Goldwater because Republicans kept telling everybody he was weak on communism, and therefore he was allowing this, besieged thing to become a reality. Reagan era stuff, all of these same ideas that have persisted. Her general assertion is that the KKK, for that 7-year flash in the pan in the 1920s, was able to just push them forward without them dying off in the American tradition. If you look at a book by Ken Barnes at UCA, he talks about anti-Catholicism in Arkansas, and he has a chapter or two on the Klan in there. But in his work, the anti-Catholicism nationwide doesn't really evaporate in any meaningful way until Kennedy's election in 1960. Al Smith in the 1920s took the brunt, even being called the Antichrist at one point. It's JFK who was able to kind of overcome. Talk about immigration. I have accidentally got into immigration history by doing what I do with the Cold War. The KKK had a massive impact on our immigration system. In the 1920s, there's already this idea about returning to normalcy. There's already the idea about curbing immigration, particularly from the socialist nations, right? So in 1924, you get the Johnson-Reed Act, right? Johnson-Reed Act massively curbs immigration. It uses data from the 1890 census to create quotas, which means if Chinese or Japanese, no, even there's already a snowball's chance in hell you're coming anyway, but now that's a no. If you're Italian, which is Catholic, that's a no for the most part. German, for the most part, a no. If you are anything but Northern or Western European, you're not coming. 1924. Now that lasts until, in various iterations, that lasts until 1965. Well, in Johnson-Reed Act, Johnson was from the state of Washington. He was a known Klansman and was supported by the Klan. The Klan passed that bill to curb our immigration, to latch on to this idea. I've used this in classes a couple of times, and my students are always too young to get it. But early 2000s, maybe South Park, they took our gerbs, they took our jobs. They ingrained that. My students always look at me like I have 3 heads. They have no idea what in the hell I'm talking about.
I actually
Classic South Park
used
episode.
that same reference in my class last semester and was like, and a student got it, and it was a 19-year-old girl with blue hair, and I was like, yes.
So, but the Klan helps ingrain that, and the idea of the immigrants taking our jobs wasn't new. I think one of the interesting ironies about early, post-Civil War labor history is that the Chinese Exclusion Act is is in part a product of Irish immigrants freaking out the Chinese are taking their jobs. Like, how the hell did that work out? But it did. But the Klan helps solidify that in a national way. They had a massive impact. The Nazis, of course, come after, but the amount of ideology that the Nazis and the second iteration of the Klan shared is, they're almost mirror images, with one startling exception. The Nazis were into, total control. They've got, crystal knocked. They're killing all their political opposition. The Klan, because they understood that white Protestants were still the majority, the Klan was happy to work through democratic politics. They didn't have to take Hitler's route. But beyond that, the Nazis end up sharing much of the ideology. And while the Klan is at the height of its power in 1925, is while Hitler is scribbling down Mein Kampf, and they're making the same anti-Jewish arguments. Their impact was just phenomenal. And I've totally lost my train of thought. But the second Klan, full circle, put that star on our flag.
I was gonna throw in. I don't think it's I think that's an important point to understand when we talk about the evolution of how the Klan's ideology became actual tangible power. And when you talk, when you were talking, Will, I was thinking about the Chinese Exclusion Act myself, and I was gonna say that it's, in my mind, it's no coincidence that within 5 years of the end of Reconstruction, you saw the beginnings of immigration control in the form of the Chinese Exclusion Act, under that same premise that these people were taking economic opportunities away from white people. And that same idea is literally the basis of the redemption, that any Black progress, any progress by people beyond the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, was a threat towards their individual freedom and their individual progress. So much so to where it even, I think that supports the point that was made about how these Klans people did use democratic policies and did infiltrate these systems to begin to make some of these decisions about policy and how immigration happens in this country.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Marie.
It's exactly what you said earlier, Airic, about it being systemic. The Klan only needs to come out in public long enough to infiltrate the system because they want to work through the democratic norms. They don't want to overtake the system. They want to become part of the system. And that's why they only last the second iteration lasts 7 years, but their policies last a generation or more.
Their educational policies, their anti-parochial school policies, their textbook policies. What killed off the second Klan in Arkansas was that 1925, the Democratic Party instituted a rule that said we will no longer accept candidates that have been vetted by a pre-primary, because the Klan was using pre-primaries to stack the primaries and then take the election. What kills it off nationally in 1927, Indiana, which had the biggest, and I need to emphasize this, I think, to anybody who might have not shut me up yet and turned me off. The second Klan was in all 48 states. This is not a Southern versus Northern morality play. They were everywhere. Indiana had the biggest contingency. Fast forward a few decades, and George Wallace in the primary takes Michigan, in his primary, running on, these same sort of ideas in the 1960s. But the second Klan, anywhere from 4 to 6 million members nationwide. They're in Oregon, they're in Washington, as in, the Johnson-Reed Act, they're in Indiana. What kills them off actually is a, really, interesting, I don't even know how to describe it. Their entire platform is respecting and protecting the sexuality of white women. Their entire platform is don't get drunk. One of the most powerful members of the KKK nationwide in Indiana, he is convicted of repeatedly raping, after repeatedly biting all over her body, by the way, his secretary. She then, because she's been raped, she's no longer pure, right? So she believes white society is no longer going to accept me. So she commits suicide He gets convicted for second-degree murder because she committed suicide, which is a really interesting point made by Linda Gordon. He did not make her commit suicide, but because he was responsible for ruining her purity, he was responsible for her death. So the Klan crumbles nationwide because they no longer have this morality-based platform to stand on. Your most powerful figure has raped a woman, and she has killed herself because of it. He was a bizarre character. He liked to bite women. He bit her all over the place. Apparently, she was like bleeding profusely from all of his bites. What is the name of the serial killer from the 18? He was killed around 1990 in Florida. They just did a thing on him on Netflix. They just had a movie about him. Zac Efron played him. Somebody help me.
I know what movie you're talking about. Hold on.
Anyway, the Indiana KKK guy, very reminiscent with the biting of the serial killer.
Bundy.
His name, Bundy, Ted Bundy. Yeah. Very Bundy-esque. So the Klan collapses. But to Marie's point, that was a really weird, sort of bubble there, anyway. But to Marie's point, they didn't have to actually prove their morality. They didn't actually have to exist all that long. In the time they had, they embedded their ideology into our systems. And again, their immigration policy lasted until at least 1965 on paper. Now, that's not to say subconsciously it didn't continue on. And then who's to say, what the impact that sort of ideology had on people that came after, like McCarthy and Nixon and Goldwater, Reagan, and so on and on. I don't want to be too current. I don't want to do too much current event. But, again, listening to Trump's inauguration speech, some of this comes out in that speech, this very dark, we're besieged, morality and jobs, which are somehow tied together always, are at stake. And this was the KKK's platform in the 1920s.
Too. So this is, and it's kind of weird to tie all this back in together, but how much do we keep bringing up sexual assault? And that's also something that's at the narrative right now, right? And I'm not lessening any movement that's going on right now with Me Too or anything, but do you guys think that could be a new way to discredit, or is that just a recurrent theme? Because right now it's I made the joke earlier, or it's not even a joke, it's a reality. It's oh, well, okay, this guy was shot, but was he a sex offender, and was he reaching for a gun? And we think he was a Marxist. It's like those are the three things you vet people against, and it's well, he was probably a sexual deviant, but that just keeps coming up, right? Is that this is at the backdrop of whether it's raping white women or whatever the narrative is, there's this weird sexual side to it that we keep bringing up. That's also heavy at the narrative here about this is something with the Trump administration. You know what? They're going to eradicate sex offenders. Right, all this Epstein stuff. This is a very thing I'm seeing that the Trump administration is touting and being look how many sex offenders Donald Trump is responsible for taking down. Right, you guys think there's any I've just repeatedly thought about that. Is it less in an era where we have people like Bernie Sanders and in his ideas? Is it less of a dig to say somebody is a Marxist, or is that more a norm, and it's we have to discredit and we have to go to straight to the sexualized side of things, right? Because I'm seeing that in some of these shootings and things, it's well, hey, that guy was a sex offender, or that guy, and I don't know if they were or not. It's daunting to me that it keeps coming up in the narrative of right now, of this other way we need to see if we can discredit this person, just see if they fit this marker first before we do any. I don't know if that's making any sense, but I keep looking at it and I'm is this a basis for a third Red Scare conceptually?
I have no educated opinion on this. I would say what stands out to me, so I know who you're talking about, that one of the people in Kenosha that was killed by the white kid with a gun is, or allegedly is, or was, I guess, a sex offender. I have no idea if that's true. It seems to me that if we can draw a parallel, or that if we can find a common theme, is that being a sex offender seems to mean that you are a candidate for mob violence. That's the only parallel that I see. If you look at all of the lynchings in the late 19th century, early 20th century, all the way up to, at least Emmett Till, I'm sure it goes further. What is the underlying, what is the accusation? Sex offender. Sex offender. So sex offender seems to mean that you are a candidate for mob justice, right? I think, and again, this is just observational. Maybe Marie or Airic have something better here. On the idea of being a sex offender, I think that the narrative has probably changed within the social sphere, is that while, this kid in Wisconsin shows us that that's still a good reason that you can be killed, apparently, outside of the justice system. But because of like the Me Too movement, I think that there is like a legitimate level of moral concern as well now. Like we're not just
why,
using.
like, I don't want to, it's a weird thing to even talk about, because I do not want to delegitimize that at all, right? Or delegitimize anything that is going on with that. So it's like a weird thing to talk about. But I wasn't even referencing the shooter situation. Like the man who was shot 7 times in the back.
Oh,
when that first happened, I don't know what that man's background is. But that was one of the early articles. They're like, he was reaching for a gun and he's a sex offender. Like,
well, I think a lot of this is conspiracy theory in this moment. Yeah. I think that the idea that there's this elite pedophile ring, and then it kind of becomes less conspiratorial, and you start talking about sex offenders. So I don't think that even deserves to be addressed at all, because it's just crazy. But I think and I may be wrong, I may have misinterpreted what you said, but you kind of alluded to the fact that maybe accusing someone of being a communist isn't enough. So you have to take that other step to say they're a sex offender, right? And I think Will's right that, one, it tells Americans in some kind of subconscious way that if someone's accused of being a sex offender, then they can be lynched, or you can be subject to this mob violence, and it's justified. It's also an underlying, it's white supremacy. I mean, you need to protect the white race because Black men are going to rape white women. That's the lost cause argument. That's the argument made in Birth of a Nation that justifies the birth of the second Klan. And I do think at some level it goes back to that again and again, this idea that sex offenders are somehow part of this narrative, or the sexual deviance is part of this narrative to end the white race in some way. So I think it's absolutely a dog whistle to white supremacists. But I think part of it is conspiratorial, and that's just a whole.
Well, the QAnon, like I'm just honestly trying to talk through like all the white noise that I'm picking up right now in this zeitgeist of like this administration, because I mean, this is something I was like in 2016, I was like, so Donald Trump is taking out all the pedophiles. That's what I'm seeing here. Like as soon as he was in office, I started seeing articles pop up about like, we have a problem with pedophiles running everything. Like that's in 2016. There was these 2 articles I was pulling up all the time back when he was first elected, like 407 pedophiles arrested. But how many articles have you seen like that since and recently? So like, I'm just like looking at that against the backdrop of everything else we're kind of talking about, is like, how does that fit? Is this being like used as a platform in some way by this administration? I mean, I would say just looking at it objectively, yes, like it is all the way back from the election, something that they are pushing. So it's been a thread I've been trying to follow without getting conspiratorial. I was telling one of my class earlier, I'm like, the thing, I used to be really conspiratorial, but then I was like, oh, I can't believe these other 5 conspiracies to believe this one.
Right.
That's how I explain it to people. It's like, I can't believe these other things just so I can believe this. Right. It's too much. Right. So Anyway.
I think that
Wow.
using the idea of being a sex offender to justify mob violence or violence by the police actually undermines legitimate, like, Me Too accusations. Like, if you can just call someone a sex offender and it justifies this violence, then it takes away from the women who actually have been the victim of this sexual violence and need that platform. So I don't think it's, I mean, yeah.
It's, well, and look how just brains, it's become a thing on both sides of this election. You and I've talked previously. It's like, what, not getting into anything about other than the fact that it's like people have accused both candidates of everything we're talking about. True, false, whatever. We'll figure it out eventually, maybe. I don't know. But it's like, that is at the backdrop. Biden, he may have done these things. We're going to tell you about it. And Trump, he definitely, we got him on camera or on audio saying that he did this. And it's like, but then the sides is saying, oh, well, but he arrested 407 of these people, so we can get over that. So it's an interesting thread that I mean, I was talking, we just brainstormed with my wife about this, who has an undergraduate in history. We just own our business together, but it's like, we're talking about To Kill a Mockingbird. And it's like how important of a thread that is of the raping white women's narrative. And it's like, has that been repurposed and weaponized in different ways is basically what I've just brainstorming, but it's been something that I just keep thinking about and have thought about a few times since we've been talking today.
I think Airic tried to say
offer that. No, yeah, I was just gonna offer, as far as the historical context, I would agree that the sexual assault has been weaponized, especially against Black people. But I think it's important to understand that what you are referencing about the use of sexual assault as a method to discredit highlights an important aspect of even historical context for that conversation. People like Ida B. Wells were important because it highlighted the relationship between these lynchings and these accusations of rape. But Ida B. Wells was the first Black person, the first person to ever articulate that these lynchings have the surface veneer of sexual assault, of merely a relationship to sexual assault. But in actuality, lynchings and this accusation about sexual assault was used as a method of control and a method of power. The people that Ida B. Wells wrote about who were lynched in her book Southern Horrors were her friends. 3 of her friends who owned a grocery store. They were Black men who owned a grocery store in Memphis, and they were very, very successful. And these men were lynched, not because of an accusation of rape, but because they were economically successful and that their progress was a threat to white supremacy. And so what you're saying is important because it highlights the weaponization of sexual assault accusations, even though there are vastly different motives for every different type of extralegal violence that occurs. It could simply be you want this person eliminated as an economic threat. If you own a grocery store and these Black people are get more, clients than you or selling more product than you, especially as a white person, that is a direct threat to your white supremacy, but it's also a direct threat to you economically. And so these accusations could easily be levied against somebody for an ulterior motive, right? And then I was also going to offer that when we talk about like the systemic nature of these problems, whether it's pedophilia or whether we're talking about racism and white supremacy, when you say the Ku Klux Klan went away in 1927 or in the late 1920s, it's important to remember that these people didn't die, right? They didn't fall off the face of the earth. They went about their day-to-day lives and infiltrated American society at every single level, taking these ideological these ideological points that they held because of their belief and commitment to the Klan and to ideas of white supremacy with them, and infiltrated these ideas into every single American system. Like these millions of people who claimed Klan membership didn't just all of a sudden die at the end of the 1920s. And so these ideas were allowed to perpetuate because the people were perpetuating the ideas. They didn't just go away. They continued to perpetuate these ideas and implement them and codify them into our American systems.
Yeah, well, I mean, that gets back to what you're, I mean, if I understand you correct, kind of what you're saying with your sphere metaphor, right? Is that it does create this, there's this infiltration that's happened. Like when you were saying that earlier, there's this concept in, well, I'm gonna segue into my other life here for a second, but this concept in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu called a berimbolo. Right. So like I tell everybody the reason my gym's name is Força Martial Arts is because of the Portuguese slave trade. And I get all into it in my master's thesis about how like we said, Japanese people, we don't want you to come here anymore. So they started migrating to Brazil and we get Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But this concept of like, you know, if you had a quarter and you flicked it and it spun on a table, right? This concept of a berimbolo is actually if I did that with a ball, right? It's not like a spinning top. It's not like when you flick a quarter across the table and it's spinning. It's actually this, right? This sort of spinning motion. And it's like, that's how I see the zeitgeist is right. Is it's like you were saying, like history is more of a sphere or even that. Like I've thought about that several times. It's like, it's like a big spinning ball going through space. It's everywhere all the time. And it definitely gets infiltrated with these ideas, and these people don't just go away. That is now in the zeitgeist. It is now in the sphere. It has now become a part of the narrative, and we have to grapple with what that means. No pun intended with the grappling remark.
Anyway. Yeah, no, absolutely. I wasn't suggesting that the Klan, you know, stopped existing in 1927 ideologically, but that its national unity was gone in 1927. And there were attempts to recreate, you know, other similar groups that never got off the ground. But yeah, no, they had achieved their goal. And right, I mean, they didn't just drop off the face of the earth. They kept going and kept doing. The goal of that version of the Klan at one point was to be a political party, which obviously didn't work out for them. So they ceased to exist as a unified, you know, thing. But yeah, you know, to Airic's point, they didn't just go away. They left us with your sphere. What?
They may have became your neighbor.
Yeah, they very well could have been.
Or your police chief. Or your administrator at the university, or your mayor, your pastor.
Well, that's important. It's like when I talk to I trained cops at my gym for free. Anybody that's a civil servant can train at my gym for free, right? So it's like my way of giving back, but it's like very few people take advantage of that, and you have to, like, when I have conversations with like one of the chiefs trains here, it's like with him, I'm like, so yeah, some cops are definitely racist. And he even has maybe a hard time admitting that. I'm like, well, could we agree that a certain percentage of people on the job are racist? Like it's a no-brainer for me, right? It's like, if it's people patrolling, it's your chief. And it's like, if it's your chief, it's maybe your mayor, right? It's like, but just how that, like, your mayor, chief of police, officers, how that flows, being unelected. But that's been something that's fascinated me. It's like, nobody even wants to admit that these people are institutionally there, right? There are racist people. There are institutions. Racist people are in the institutions, like a certain percentage. I mean, but you say that in that same way, and people are like, no, not our institutions. No, not around here. The place that's got a rich history associated with what we're talking about. No.
Joe Steinmetz made that actual comment. Joe Steinmetz said that he didn't believe that racism was a problem at the University of Arkansas. or he said he didn't believe that we had a racist institution. And I understand the context in which he was making the statement, because he was literally coming from that same perspective that the institution itself isn't 100% racist. But that doesn't discredit the fact that the university itself supports white supremacy in many capacities, right? And it's because of the absence of an alternative presence within these institutions. An institution itself is just an institution, right? It has no moral quantity. It's like fire or anything else, like science. You know, it has no real moral quality. But because the institution itself does not have reflect the diversity of the people that of the space that it's in, it's allowed to support one demographic over another, right? And with that absence of a presence, the entire institution will take on that field, even if every aspect of the institution isn't 100% racist. If there's an absence of these alternative presences, then the entire institution will take on that field.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's so so Marie, have you been following anything with this was the student that was stopped here? Like, I was in a conversation with you talking about this judge's son, like,
That's my friend Andrew.
Okay, yeah. I don't know him, but like, I've talked with Meredith. I was in a group chat about this. Like, what's going on with that? Like, can anybody in here kind of speak to that? Like, I've done some background, like, just had a couple conversations, talk with Meredith about it, a friend of Marie and I's. But on that note is that when law enforcement was probed about this issue, they totally seized up about, like, no, you know what, you're putting us at risk. The people with the guns that watch you, you're putting us at risk by questioning. And I was just like, really? Like, we can't even question this stop with this officer who actually has a previous incident that has gone awry with citizens. It's like, but do you guys know anything about that? That's just another recent event that's going on here in the state. But I mean, it sounds like you do.
I'm not familiar with the details of Andrew's case. I know Andrew. I haven't followed that case because of the nature of the case and because it's, to me personally, reflective of the larger systemic problem. Like, Andrew's case is not unique. You know what I mean? Andrew's case is unfortunate, but Andrew's case is by no means unique. And I believe that the point that you're making about scrutiny further highlights the systemic nature of the conversation about power. That whenever a question is presented about the practices or the policies, that is taken as a direct threat, as opposed to an evolving working condition, right? The police themselves should continuously evolve in how they practice and how they operate, but that's not the goal. If the goal is for them to maintain power, then any questioning will be taken as a direct threat.
Right. And it didn't help the situation that this police officer had this huge prior incident in Dover either. And so I think that part of the seizing up with this issue was that people are questioning, why is he still employed? Because the incident in Dover was a huge deal. I mean, because Dover's a community of 2,000 people, and that was a upstanding member, like, family in the community that he tased violently, the mother and the son. And so I think that people just assumed that when those things happen, those cops they're no longer police officers.
They go work at the adjacent town many times.
Yes.
And, like, you know, for my role is like, I'm sitting over here being like, hey, will you guys come train at my gym for free so you won't shoot people as much? And they're like, no, we don't have time for that. Like quite literally, like, we don't have time to learn how to not kill people. Like, that is the literal response. It's like, it's free for you and your whole family. You can just come here, right? Because, like, many police departments across the U.S., many are going to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a use of force model of, like, hey, you don't have to shoot people if you just know how to control them, and you can keep your wits about you. You don't have to shoot them in the back. 6 additional times. Like, who was it that was making the point? It's like, what purpose does bullets 2 through 7 serve in that scenario? You know, it's like we can do things that are better in terms of just training our people to not shoot people in police custody without them ever even being charged of a crime or seeing the inside of a court of law. Like that, it bothers me that we can't even get, like around here, we can't even get the narrative in. It's like, yes, police need better training just in general. All other things we talked about today aside, national narrative you look at, there's no need. Like, I'm gonna tell you guys right now, like, I never need to put my knee on somebody's neck like that. It's not required. There's so many better ways to do that without inducing panic in somebody. It's like, I mean, there's just better ways to do it, right? And like, I can speak on that, and it's like, but like many things, we don't want to hear about this better way to do it, right? It's not anything we want to take into account. So that's my 2 cents on the systemic issues. Is like, well, they don't even admit that there's a problem in training that leads to use of force being an issue. Racial lines or no, right? It's like use of force is an issue. And I think we need to start addressing that on a systemic level too. It's like, and I, you know, too, we've seen this year, it's like the whole rubber bullets narrative and the less lethal methods. It's like, how many eyeballs have been lost in 2020 due to these rubber bullets and non-lethal methods? It's like, how about we come up with a whole other way, right? I'm all for that. It's like, that's what I see defund the police as. It's like, I see it as like refund would be a better way of putting it, right? Refunding everything. It's like they now presently, this is a sidebar, but they send cops that don't train in martial arts to these certification courses with martial artists like myself. Then the non-martial arts cop that got the certification comes back and trains the non-martial artist officers in martial arts techniques. And that's how we spend our tax money, people. Like, don't talk to me about the budget. You spent $18,000 to send a non-martial artist to Texas to train with the martial artists when every school, every town has my gym, you know? It makes no sense. Just outsource it locally. Soapbox.
Those aren't the goals, man. Like, hey, I box. That's what I
Do you go to Straight Right?
Gym here in Northwest. I do. I box at a Straight Right gym, Straight Right Boxing and Fitness.
Dude, I have a boxing club.
Yeah, I mean, we got a great relationship with martial art gyms and with martial arts throughout the state. But the point that I'm bringing that up with about is to your point about these policies. The policies and the practices reflect the actual goals. And your question about what do bullets 2 through 7 serve? They serve the same goal as putting your knee on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It's about power. It's not a question of subduing these people. It's a question of asserting your power to dominate their body and to even take their life, right? And it's a question of your ability and the fact that these people aren't arrested, your legalized ability to assert your power, even lethally. That's where bullets 2 through 7 come in. That's where your knee putting on somebody's neck for that long comes in. Because as you know, as a martial artist, you don't need a weapon to do any of the things that police actually do or are tasked to do. You don't need a lethal weapon to do that. But the lethality is because these people are commissioned by the United States to be judge, jury, and executioner on the site, right? They are given the authority to make these decisions over life and death, especially concerning Black and brown bodies. So there is the power aspect of it is the reason that bullets 2 through 7 happen.
Man, it is I just like it described like this. I know this is kind of just another big 2020 narrative backdrop as I wave my mask around in my studio, right? But it's like, this is the brutality, the violence. Man, I do think that there's got to be a shift in that in how we're doing everything. It's like with law enforcement and training. I don't know, like defunding the police. That's something that everybody has gotten up in arms about. And I'm like, I just don't want, my whole life, I am a law abiding citizen. I own a business, and my whole life that I can't even imagine being a non-white person. I've been afraid of cops my whole life. I see a cop and I'm like, oh, am I breaking the law? Oh, I'm not. I'm a law-abiding citizen. It's good. Okay, we're good here. Oh my God. Am I going 10 over, under? Am I too slow, too fast? And it's like, I can't, that is me, a law-abiding citizen that says like Russellville police boxing on the side of his car. I literally don't even worry about getting pulled over around here. Everybody knows me. I train the cops for free, but it's still like, I'm like, oh. So I can't imagine that being extrapolated to people who live on the margins of the law, or just like, you don't look like Brian, so, and you're not doing the things that Brian's doing in your community, so you're likely, way much more likely to get pulled over, right? You're not from around here, right? Oh, you just passing through? We don't like people who aren't from around. That kind of seemed like the narrative of this law student that was pulled over. It's like, hey, we don't like outsiders. You need to take your U-Haul and move on down the road. Like, that's just reading the reports is like, is that really the message we want to send to fellow Arkansans with this institution of law enforcement? Or is that reinforcing everything we've talked about, right? So, yeah.
So we have talked about a lot, and we did start out to talk about the flag.
Let's bring it back into the flag, all right?
So I'm hungry, all right? So
Friday.
I want to point out a couple of things. So Greg Leding, a state senator who he's never going to listen to this. He's been not useful whatsoever. He only replied to my email because Marie like hounded him like crazy on Twitter. It was one of the most impressive things I've ever seen. I mean, she was like, it was like Twitter bullying. But like
that
nicer.
Wasn't mean. Yeah, very nice Twitter bullying.
Other than that, he's pretty useless, and he kind of talks around you a lot. And from talking to other people around here, I get that impression from a lot of people, about him. So if he ever does listen to this, although that he won't, you should maybe be a little, less the way that you are. Anyway, he is, I'm not in his district, so he doesn't give a shit what I think, but he has occasionally tweeted about the flag off and on over the summer, since the thing with Mississippi started back in June. So Mississippi changed their flag. And which kind of irritates me, because I'll tweet back at him and be like, hey, dude, let's talk about this. And then it's just like, butterflies, but whatever. He randomly tweeted something to the effect of like, if you could start completely over with the Arkansas flag, what would you do? And a couple of people actually submitted designs on Twitter that they mocked up real quick that look kind of good, which isn't all that helpful in the moment, but I tweeted a few of them, and maybe they'll kind of, tweet back, and we can maybe have a conversation about this. This needs to be a statewide conversation, obviously. And if he's doing nothing else, by kind of hijacking the narrative, he's being, inadvertently helpful. But to try to come kind of full circle, you guys were having like an intense conversation.
Sorry about the law enforcement tirade in the martial arts.
About systemic racism, institutionalized racism, and all of these things. And these are concepts that a lot of people have a hard time, getting their mind around. Airic addressed this with the Steinmetz statement, for example. And he said something very interesting too. I think that an institution has no soul, right? An institution is comprised of the people that make it up. It's comprised of the people that control it. Because this is, again, to Airic's point, this is a conversation about power, right? So this idea of institutionalized racism, maybe I'm wrong. Follow me here. If you don't want to, believe that it exists, if you don't want to look at universities or police departments or whatever, full circle, look at the Arkansas state flag. We have a star on our flag. A flag, according to the Arkansas State Secretary, to the Arkansas Secretary of State's website, a flag that represents all of us is what they're. You should read the website, by the way. It's totally tone deaf. It's hilarious. But according to the Arkansas Secretary of State, this flag stands for all Arkansans. It cannot stand, fly, wave, dangle, or anything else for all Arkansans because of that star. That star was placed there by an organization, the second iteration of the Klan, that hated all four of us, that hated every Catholic in this state, every Jew in this state, every immigrant in this state, that insulted every Native American in this state by claiming that they, the Klan, were the Native Americans. And they put a star on our flag that in turn commemorates an entity that existed for no other reason than to preserve slavery, that wrote into the state constitution that the state assembly could never abolish slavery. The flag is not for all of us. That flag is a symbol of what happens when an institution, in Airic's words, a soulless entity, is taken over by people that are racist and commemorate that racism in a way that impacts everybody underneath that institution. And in this regard, that institution is the state, it is the flag. There you have it.
That's perfect.
So what's the future of the flag? In you three historians' minds, what is the most considerate compromise moving forward? Because it kind of seems like that's the way to go, is sort of a middle ground. Like, what is the planned change in symbolism that you guys have in mind?
The compromise is to accept Charles Blake's bill. Charles Blake is an interesting position in that he was the former representative from Pulaski County. The man that put the star on the flag was the representative from Pulaski County. That is a nice way for history to maybe not correct itself, but to nullify its own actions. That is the compromise. Ideally, because, you know, symbolism is very important. And people say, oh, well, that's just a statue. That's just a plaque. It's just a road name. It's just a bridge. If it's just that, then why do you cling to it so hard? Symbolism is not nothing. Symbolism is everything. So the ultimate goal, the preferred goal, would be a redesign, because we need the symbolism of the flag coming down the pole and a flag that looks differently going up the pole. So the compromise is Charles Blake. The ideal is you redesign it.
Okay. Yeah, which I'm much more for, like, a complete redesign myself, right? Like, I've seen, like, it seems like everybody, well, I'm not everybody, but it seems like there's a big narrative of, like, let's change the symbols of what each star stands for. But it's like, I'm way more of the camp of a redesign. Do you think that's what will happen?
That depends, I think, just my opinion, that depends largely on how the November 3rd election goes. If, if Trump wins re-election, then I think the people that really cling to these certain narratives, the lost cause, are going to double down. Somehow a man from New York has made the lost cause our national heritage. I don't know how that happened, but it did. I think they double down. And I think people in the Arkansas Assembly double down that are already on that train of thought. If he loses, and if some of them lose, and the remainders have to have kind of a coming to Jesus moment where they sort of reevaluate their priorities and kind of, you know, how hard they want to cling to these things, then maybe we can get more. Maybe we can redesign it. But I think we're kind of at a point right now where we kind of have to wait and see. You know, the Arkansas state legislature, no matter who wins, no matter who's sitting in whatever seat, is going to face some demons in January. The governor himself is putting every drop of political capital that he has into a hate crime bill. They're going to have to face that. They're going to have to talk about what that means and why it's necessary and what those things are meant for. There are other legislators that want to talk about things like prison reform. They're going to have to talk about the underlying issue of reform. You know, talk about the extreme discrepancy between who is imprisoned and who is not, and why they are imprisoned and why they are not. It's going to be very much a coming to Jesus moment in January, February, March for the assembly as it is. So we'll just have to see where they go. But just because you tack the word progress onto something does not mean that it's good. Not all progress is good. The Nazis thought they were progressive, okay? But change comes, and change is going to come. And no matter, and look, and I don't want to participate in the culture war. I don't think that's particularly productive. But this is a culture war at the moment. It's a renewed culture war. And what history teaches us is that the reactionary side does not win. They might linger. They might create narratives that make it look like they won, that last for a while, but they never actually win. It might be slow and it might be rough, but this change will happen.
Yeah. All right. Well, you guys want to go ahead and wrap it up on that note? I know we've been all over the place, but I grew from today's conversation. Hopefully it was beneficial for you guys too, who I perceived to be way smarter than myself. But
I know a little bit about a little bit. That's about
I
it.
know more about jiu-jitsu than history, sadly. It feels like every time I talk to another historian. So, it has been super humbling getting to sit down and talk with you guys. Hopefully it won't be the last time.
Yeah,
Hopefully
for
not.
sure.
Thank
you.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for the platform and all of the things.
Hey, yeah, well, again, I really would be open. I'm going to have Marie on again, but I would be down to just do an individual podcast with any of you. So I'll link up with y'all on the other side of this.
Yeah, I would be happy to talk to you about the fact that Jimmy Carter being a human rights guy first is another historical myth.
That's a podcast right there. Hell yeah.
Yeah, I talk with you too, man. I do research about talk about systemic racism. I do research about the interstate system and how it was used to achieve various goals of white supremacy. And so, yeah, I don't mind talking with you at any time.
Excellent. All right. Well, we'll do it. I'm just like been in a couple of, I just moved to this new studio. So I haven't been doing a ton of podcasts. I'm getting just got my 65-inch screen hung up here on my right. Like I've been getting moved into my new gym and the semester's off and there's COVID but the ball is back rolling. This is like my first podcast of this semester, really. I did have a tiny desk performance. I did, so you guys can look for that. I'm doing a live band in here in the studio once a month. It's a really big studio. And so that'll be something. Ryan Harmon is coming on in September. He was on American Idol from Arkansas. You guys look him up. He's got like tons of views. But so like I just spin this podcast in a ton of different directions. So I'll definitely look forward to having you guys back on.
Cool.
Thank you.
Good.
All right.
Be careful tomorrow.
All right. Yes, I will. We'll see you later.
Bye.
Y'all have a good one.
You
See ya.
too.